Broadcast is live. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Mark Batty, and this is sort of a funny talk. It's going to be a dual talk with me doing the first half, and then Simon Cooksey, who you might be able to see in a little picture at the side, doing the second half. We're going to talk about e-bikes, and we're going to try to introduce you to the idea of building e-bikes, and regular bikes too, as a fun maker project. Like I said, we're going to go into two halves. I'm going to talk about what is a bike and how do you make one. And then Simon's going to do a technical primer on e-bike batteries, motors, and controllers, which will be a lot more detailed. My part is really inspiration to try to get you excited about the idea of building bikes. So what is a bike? This slide has a bunch of pictures of what most people will think of when they think of bikes. They're these kind of two-wheeled things with steering at the front, a seat in the middle, and pedals that drive the rear wheel. And they typically have a kind of two triangle diamond-shaped frame, or some approximation of that. And maybe they have an electric motor. You can buy e-bikes from Halfords now. But I want to make the case that bikes are a huge space of maker opportunities, and they're quite different opportunities to build. So let's start by looking at some slightly out there bikes. So you can play with the geometry of a bicycle. So here we've got a bunch of bikes where that two triangle diamond shape is completely subverted. The low one on the bottom right is called a recumbent. There's a Strider bicycle on the left. That's a triangle shaped frame. I have one of those. It's awful. And there's all sorts of other opportunities if you look out there for weird stuff to build. There's this whole space of cargo bikes where it's really usually not two wheels sometimes, but the shape of the bike and the entire design of the bike is tuned to some purpose, carrying maybe children or cargo or whatever. And this is kind of a growing field. The one on the top right is actually a really ambitious project where they've tried to containerize goods at a smaller container size that fits in like commercial vans, but also will go on a cargo bike. And they're using those in Germany to do last mile deliveries. Really interesting. So then there's sort of bicycle subcultures where the attitude of the bicycle is what's important. And people compete with each other to build more and more elaborate machines that follow a particular line of thought. So we've got the lady on the left is riding an LA lowrider bicycle, and the guy on the top right is from New York, where they build sound system bicycles. In the middle, it's these three are American. The lady is from Chunk 66 in Portland, who build these sort of steampunky, messy things that are typically toll bikes. And then in the bottom right is a Japanese man who's built a Decatura truck style bicycle. So these are pretty weird, not necessarily practical bicycles, but you would never have used one of these in the past, but now you can electrify these things. So you can build a weird bike that's too heavy and then throw an electric motor on it and maybe use it. There's another sort of vein of bikes called velocars, where you're taking some design aspect from a car and building that into a bicycle. So you still have pedals, but you might have side-by-side seating, and you might have a roof, a canopy, that kind of thing. It might look a bit like a car. So these are all homemade projects. Apart from the one bottom left, that's a 1930s project, a commercial product by a company called Moshe in Paris. So these things were once a mainstream idea. So then we've got velomobiles and streamliners. If you want to go 60 miles an hour on a human-powered bicycle, you need a velomobile. So these things are engineered for hardcore high speed, and they have fairings essentially to allow them to do these things. And what that does is cut down the aerodynamic wind resistance to the point where the 100 watts, 200 watts that a human can put out will take you to fabulously high speeds. These things are expensive, commercially bought, but you can make them as a DIYer, and some people ride them around London. That guy there runs a YouTube channel and rides his velomobile to work. Pretty interesting. And then there are people who build just completely off the wall stuff. So ideas, really, experiments. So this is 3 of them. The one on the left, the triangle bike, is designed so that you never need to adjust it. Whoever steps onto that bike, by virtue of the triangle shape, should get something that's the right size for them. The one in the middle has skateboard steering at the back, rather than active steering, so you lean to steer. And the one on the right is front wheel drive and rear steering, which is a complicated thing to get right. But there's a video of him riding it. It looks pretty hairy, but it does work. And then I want to say, there are things that are not bicycles. There are electric vehicles like electric scooters and hoverboards and electric skateboards that are sort of legally not bicycles. And you get something good for being a bicycle, and these things don't get that thing. I want to talk about the law, essentially. Now, this isn't legal advice. I'm giving you an approximate hit here of what the law is so you can understand what kind of thing you can achieve by making it. But the big win for building something that's technically a bicycle is that you can ride on the road and ride on cycle paths without a registration license or insurance. So that means the amount of paperwork you need to do to build and ride your own creations of bicycles practically every day is 0. This is not true for instance, electric scooters if you're following the letter of the law, which obviously nobody does. Those are not permitted on sidewalks, cycle paths, or the road without registration, license, and insurance. Just ridiculous. That's probably going to change. I'll talk about that in a sec. So yeah, what does a bike have to have? It's got to have pedals. You've got to have wheels and a brake for the front wheels and a brake for the rear wheels. You need lights and reflectors if you're going to travel at night. And if it's an e-bike, it actually needs the lights and reflectors at that point. And it also must have a motor which is marked as less than 250 watts. It's got to only be driven while pedaling, and only up to 15.5 miles an hour, which if you ride a bicycle, you'll know is a sort of nice commuting pace. It's, you know, racing cyclists will get occasionally faster than that, but it's pretty swift, 15.5 on a bicycle. And the regulations for e-bikes are at this link. I'm going to post the links into the chat at the end of the talk. E-bikes, there's a future here, which is really interesting, and that's that urban transport hopefully will go in a direction, it is in Europe and it hopefully will in Britain, where we get more cycling infrastructure. And I think the government has started to recognize the safety wins in bikes. If you shift one person out of a car, the car is a relatively deadly way of moving yourself around for yourself and others. If you move one person into a bike, you've created a net safety gain. And there's a study I didn't link to, but I could if I can find it if anyone's interested. That transition creates more safety in a net way than is helmet use is not important, right? So if you don't use helmets, it doesn't make things less safe more than using the car. So the government is consulting on e-bikes and e-scooters, and I think makers should have a voice. So I've gone to this consultation and said what I think they should do. And I really encourage all of you to do that as well, because this is a cool space for making stuff. And they're changing the regulations as we speak, generally liberalizing them, which is good for us. Higher power, perhaps higher speeds, and that kind of thing. No need for pedals. Those are the things they're looking at, but you can encourage them. Please go to this link. You don't have to answer all the questions. You can just pick the few that you're interested in and answer those. I'd encourage everyone to do that. So how do you actually make one? So I'm only going to give you a really cursory little bit about that. The best thing I can tell you is go to Sheldon Brown's website. He's incredible. He's dead now, unfortunately, but his website's a huge repository of everything you need to know about bikes in order to maintain and build them. There's a simulation tool by Cornell researchers, which will allow you to simulate and figure out whether your weird bicycle geometries are going to be stable or not. So that's really good for if you want to build like a rear steering bike or something really weird. And then there's this gear calculator I've found useful. So what strategy should you take? Obviously, if you go weird, it's going to be harder. If you go conventional, it'll be easier. We strongly suggest that you just take a bike and add a motor for your first project. Personally, I suggest don't go wider than 850 millimeters, because most commercial bikes fit in that. Even the big cargo bikes fit in that spec, and you'll be able to navigate a lot of weird barriers you encounter. So here's 3 of the bikes that we have in the Canterbury maker scene. So that's Dan's on the left, Simon's in the middle, and mine on the right. And each of us have done a relatively modest thing by mostly just adding a motor. Mine's got a cargo bucket on the front for carrying my kid to nursery as well. So my second project, I want to do something weird. This is indulgence for me, this slide, really. I'd like to build a velo car with a plywood body. And I've been looking at all of these weird cars, like micro cars and concept cars, to try to get inspiration for what I'd like to do. But maybe in the future, I'll be able to come back and show you where that turned out. Okay, so I took 1 minute longer than I'm supposed to, and I'm going to hand over to Simon now. I think we have to swap the slide back. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Hello. So, yeah, I'm Simon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the technical practicalities of building an e-bike. And there are sort of 3 core components that you need. You need a battery or some power source for the bike, something to control the motor so that your pedaling input or throttle input turns into power at the motor itself, which is the 3rd component. And I'll talk about these in turn. But first up is the battery. I think this is probably one of the more complicated parts. If you're going to DIY it, it's probably the most expensive part. So it's the one you're most likely to want to build yourself. So most e-bike batteries are made with these the same sort of batteries that were originally used in electric cars and are used commonly in USB power banks, vapes, that sort of thing. And they're called 18650s. 18650 is a size, a bit like AA. They're 18 millimeters in diameter and 65 millimeters in length. 650 millimeters in length, I think. No, 65, sorry. So, it's just a physical size. And they also have a capacity, so the amount of energy they can store. On cells, it's normally recorded in amp hours. That's not actually energy, but we'll get onto that in a second. But a typical 18650 might be 2.75 amp hours or 2,750 milliamp hours. In my bike, I used Samsung 29E cells. This is a name brand, so a manufacturer of cells, and 29E is a specific type. These happen to be 2.9 amp hours. If you buy them from the internet, it's a bit tricky. There are different suppliers. Not all of them are reputable. I bought mine from a seller on Endless Sphere. They were $2 each, so about £2. The slide isn't changing very well for me. Hopefully it's appeared correctly for you. No. Interesting. There we go. So just a couple of notes on the specs that are important about batteries. So their capacity is measured in amp hours, but you really need to know about energy. If you're going to compare batteries, it's important that you compare them with energy. So a 10 amp hour battery at 12 volts is much smaller than a 10 amp hour battery at 48 volts. To get energy, it's really easy. You just multiply the capacity by the voltage. This gives you a number in watt hours, and that tells you how long you can power a given load. So a 1000 watt hour battery will power a 1000 watt load for 1 hour. There's a couple of other numbers relating to batteries that talk about the configuration of the cells within them. There's a series rating, so how many batteries you have connected together in series. This gives you the voltage of the battery. So if you've got a 6S battery, that's 6 cells connected in series. So you take the series voltage of a cell, which is at most 4.2 volts if you're using lithium, multiply that by 6, and you get around 22 point something volts. And then there's the parallel rating. This is how you increase the capacity of your battery, or the energy of it, without changing the voltage. So you wire multiple series packs in parallel, and this increases the energy you have in your battery without affecting the voltage. So on my bike, I have a 13S7P battery. This gives me around 48 volts, just a smidge over, and it gives me about 20 amp hours of capacity, which turns into 1,100 watt hours. So that's how much energy is in my battery. So my bike can run a 1,000 watt load for a smidge over an hour. So there's a few choices on what kind of batteries you use. I strongly recommend using lithium-ion batteries, but it's important to know the alternatives. You can use RC plane and drone batteries. These are normally lithium polymer batteries. I don't have one to hand, but they're pretty common. They're cheap-ish, and you can buy them from Hobby King. They come in high capacity, high voltage, ready to go. So you can buy a sort of a 10 amp hour 6S battery for around £100 and plug it directly into a common 24 volt e-bike system, and it will work. It will power the bike. If you want higher voltages than that, you need to wire multiple in series typically. So you'll buy 2 of these LiPos. It's not the cheapest way to get energy for your bicycle, but it's straightforward. You don't have to weld anything. You can just use soldering. Life is good. The step up is to build a lithium-ion pack. This allows you to customize the voltage, so you can pick the voltage that's just right for your controller rather than a nearby LiPo voltage from seriesing them up. And you can build much higher capacity batteries. They're also quite a lot cheaper for the energy. So I've got on this slide some napkin maths on how much it cost for a watt hour of energy. It can be very low cost. It can be more expensive if you just buy one off the shelf, but it's still not exorbitant. So I think Dan has a commercial battery on his bike. That's the one at the top of the screen, the red bike. Mark and I both have DIY batteries. Mark now has a lithium-ion cell or lithium-ion battery, but he started with lead acid. Lead acid is very cheap, but it's got terrible performance. You can't draw huge current from lead acid batteries without the voltage dropping, so your bike will feel anemic. Charging them, you have to do it very slowly, otherwise you damage the batteries. They're very heavy. They require, a little bit of TLC, I think more so than lithium ions. I'll just show you some pictures of the tools you need for battery pack construction, or rather the tool you need for battery pack construction, which is a spot welder. You shouldn't solder lithium cells because the heat from soldering damages the chemistry and can cause problems. Some of them can be quite dramatic, so it's not good to solder them. But spot welding them applies just the right amount of energy in a very concentrated place to weld strips of nickel typically to the top of the cells. You can also weld copper to them if you want high current capacity, but these cells aren't really good for that anyway. So it's unnecessary on most bikes. I've put a bit of jargon in here. I've said that there's a BMS. To keep all the cells healthy, you need a BMS in your battery pack. You just wire this according to the manufacturer, and all it does is keep all of the cells at the same voltage so that none of them dip too far. It's just a safety precaution in the battery. Cool. So the next thing is motors. These are what drive the bike. My slides aren't transitioning well. There are a few different options. You can attach a motor to the bottom of the bike on the bottom bracket. You can have a hub motor, and you can have different types of motors. Oops. So that this is Mark's motor in the bottom right, and that's a brushed DC motor. Dan and I, so Dan is the large image, and I'm in the top left. We have brushless DC motors. So there's a trade-off here as well. Brushed DC motors are very cheap. They can be a little loud, especially if they've got gears, which they sort of need because their torque is low. Brushless hub motors are quite cheap. They're available online quite easily. They can be very quiet, but they're very heavy and they're in the wheel. So it leads to strange dynamics as you ride the bike. You get used to it. I think it's fine, but some people don't like it. Bottom bracket motors are really ideal. They fall into the normal part for drivetrain for a bicycle. So your bicycle feels like a bike still, but they can be quite expensive. They're typically lighter than bottom bracket motors they're typically lighter than hub motors because they form part of the gearing in your bike so that they don't have to have so much torque. As such, they become more compact. A quick note on motor current. So while the regulations state that your motor has to be labeled for a particular power, the reality is that motors will essentially sink as much current as you like before they catch fire. So a 1000 watt motor at 48 volts will draw about 20 amps. This is important to note because if you're targeting a particular power, you need to have a battery that's capable of delivering the right amount of current. Batteries have limits on their discharge. So the 29E cells that I use in my bike are limited for 8 amp peak discharge. So while I could get the 48 volts from a large motor, I can't necessarily get the current to drive it. So if I built a 13S 1P pack, I wouldn't be able to get 20 amps to my motor. The thing that actually does the current limiting is the controller. There's trade-offs here. There's lots of different types. The typical ones that you'll buy on AliExpress or get with a kit are trapezoidal control. They produce quite loud coil whine from the motor, so it sounds a bit like a spaceship, which is kind of cool, but it's pretty loud. They're very cheap. They're efficient enough, and they're easy to wire up, so that's nice. You can get other types of fancier controllers. These are more expensive. I won't go into great detail about them because you're unlikely to encounter them unless you're being quite enthusiastic about this. But it's nice to know that they exist. As Mark said, there are some resources on building bikes. Sheldon Brown has been very useful for me, especially for things like wheels, where there's, for me, it's quite complex. I'm not a bike builder. Things like spokes and tire sizes and wheel sizes, it's all a miasma to me. Endless Sphere is excellent. It's an e-bike forum. There are lots of resources there, lots of information about building battery packs, choosing motors, the varieties of motors around, common types, how much they should cost, that sort of thing. And just general nerdy discussion about e-bikes. And I put a link to the source for my spot welder. The one I use is made by a German chap who posts a lot on Endless Sphere. It's very good. It allows you to control weld energy rather than weld current, which is kind of cool. I don't know how necessary that is, but it works very well. I have one, so if local makers are wanting to build an e-bike, they can contact me and I can lend it to them. Mark's added some more links. I encourage everyone to respond to the consultation and suggest things like removing the power limit and only having a speed limit, because if you've got a very heavy bike, 250 watts doesn't go that far. If you've got an extremely light bike, 250 watts goes a very long way. So the power limit is a bit daft. A speed limit, I think, is very sensible. I think I'm out of time. Let me just check to see if there are any questions.
Let me jump in also and say I put the links in the Discord chat if anyone wants them now, but we should also make the slides available on the BarCamp website.
Ed asks if we've seen the murmurings of councils closing off roads to improve cycle infrastructure. That would be really nice. Cycling from where I live to Canterbury is okay, but there are clearly some bits where people use roads as rat runs, and this is sort of it interacting with aggressive drivers, especially where there's traffic calming and you've got to be in the gutter quite frequently to go around speed bumps, means that these drivers are problematic.
I want to jump in and say Canterbury cycling infrastructure is weird because we have some excellent stuff, like along the Stour and up to the university. There are some excellent runs for bicycles. But yeah, the urban infrastructure, once you start getting to the places where the cars are, really sucks and could use a lot of improvement. So we should probably ask the council for this over time.
Running pre-built batteries have implications for making sure they don't discharge too far. Yeah, you have to be careful to not over-discharge lithium-ion cells. They're much more forgiving than lithium polymer batteries, though. But most BMSs will have undervoltage protection, so they'll just switch off and you'll have to push your bike. That said, if you've got an idea of the range of your bike and you know roughly how hard you push it, it should be fine. Alternatively, lots of e-bikes have cycle computers on them that tells you the voltage of the battery, so you can keep an eye on it. You don't really want to go below 3 volts per cell as like a minimum on lithium-ion cells. I tend to keep my bottom limit to 3.3 volts per cell because it will improve the life. Cool. All right. I think that's all the questions. Thanks very much.